He just wanted a plate of food to play. They mocked him without knowing who he was. Walter Johnson hadn't eaten for 3 days when he spotted the elegant banquet hall in the Upper East Side neighborhood of New York City. The 68-year-old man carefully held the crumpled paper where he had written down the address, his hands trembling from hunger and the chill of the New York night. It was then that he timidly approached the establishment's manager, an arrogant man named Brian, and made a simple request that would change everything that night. "Please, sir, I play piano. If you give me a plate of food, I can play during the event," said Walter, his voice weak but full of dignity. Brian looked up and down at this black man in worn-out clothes, an old wool cap, and hole-ridden shoes, and let out a cruel laugh. "You? Play piano?" He laughed loudly, drawing the attention of other employees. "Look here, everyone, the beggar here wants to play piano at the Williams wedding." The waiters stopped what they were doing and also began to laugh. Walter lowered his head, feeling the heat of shame rise to his face, but he didn't move. "Listen here, old man," continued Brian, pushing Walter toward the door. "This is a high-class event. The Williams family paid a fortune for everything to be perfect. We're not going to let a homeless person ruin our reputation." "But I know how to play, sir. I can prove it," insisted Walter, gently resisting the push. "Prove it?" Brian laughed even louder. "What are you going to play? Some song you heard in the park?" At that moment, Richard Williams, the owner of the establishment and the father of the bride, appeared. At 52, he had built an empire in the luxury events business, but his expression at that moment showed more curiosity than irritation. "What's going on here, Brian?" asked Richard, observing the scene. "Nothing important, Mr. Williams. Just a beggar who wants to play piano at your daughter's wedding," replied Brian, still laughing. Richard studied Walter for a moment. There was something in the elderly man's posture, in the way he held his hands, that caught his attention. "Let him in," said Richard, to everyone's surprise. "Sir?" Brian questioned, incredulous. "I said let him in. I want to see this," repeated Richard, a mischievous smile forming on his lips. Walter was led into the hall, filled with elegantly dressed guests. The contrast between his simple clothes and the luxurious setting was striking. Conversations stopped, champagne glasses hung suspended in the air, and all eyes turned to him. In the center of the hall, a grand black piano gleamed under the crystal chandelier. The pianist hired for the event, a young man named Michael, watched the scene with contempt. "Richard, what are you doing?" whispered his wife, Sarah, in his ear. "Just having a bit of fun," he replied, loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Let's see what kind of show this man can give us." Murmurs spread through the hall. Some guests pulled out their cell phones, hoping to record something embarrassing to share later. Walter walked slowly to the piano, his weak legs protesting with every step. When he sat on the bench, he adjusted its height with movements that revealed a familiarity with the instrument. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out, now continuing. "Well," said Richard, clapping his hands to get everyone's attention. "Everyone, our special guest is going to treat us to a performance. Let's all listen carefully." Some nervous laughter echoed through the hall. Walter closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and placed his hands on the keyboard. When the first chord sounded, the silence that fell was absolute. It wasn't the simple music everyone expected to hear. It was Chopin, Nocturne in E-flat major, performed with a technique and sensitivity that left even the musicians present speechless. The notes flowed as if the piano were an extension of Walter's soul. Each chord carried decades of experience, of pain, of a love for music that transcended any social barrier. His calloused hands danced across the keys with a gracefulness that contrasted with his humble appearance. Michael, the hired pianist, felt a knot in his stomach. He had studied that piece for months and had never managed to perform it with such perfection. Who was that man? In the middle of the audience, a 73-year-old lady named Mrs. Eleanor began to cry silently. She was a retired music teacher and immediately recognized not only the impeccable technique, but something deeper in that interpretation. The music continued, and Walter began to improvise, transforming Chopin's classic into something unique and personal. It was as if he were telling his story through the keys, speaking of a life that had known glory and now knew only suffering. Richard watched everything in shock. What had started as a cruel joke was turning into something completely different. The guests were no longer laughing. They listened in religious silence, some with tears in their eyes. When Walter finished, the silence remained for long seconds. Then one person began to clap, then another. In moments, the entire hall was on its feet, applauding with an intensity rarely seen at social events. Walter rose from the bench with difficulty, emotion and physical weakness combining. He gave a small bow, as he had done thousands of times in the past, in other times, in other places. "My God," whispered Sarah to her husband. "Who is that man?" But before Richard could answer, Brian quickly approached, his face red with anger and embarrassment. All right, the show's over," he shouted, trying to disperse the crowd forming around the piano. "Let's get back to the party." "Wait," said Mrs. Eleanor, approaching Walter with determined steps. "May I speak with you?" Walter nodded timidly. The elderly lady studied his face carefully, as if searching for something familiar. "How did you learn to play like that?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "I learned a long time ago, ma'am," replied Walter, lowering his eyes. "I was a professional pianist for many years." "A professional pianist?" Michael interjected into the conversation, incredulous. "If that were true, I would know you. I know all the important pianists in the country." "Perhaps you hadn't been born yet when I played," said Walter gently, without sarcasm in his voice. Mrs. Eleanor continued studying his face, something very familiar stirring her memory. She had been a piano teacher at conservatories for over 40 years, had known many talents, but that technique, that interpretation. "What is your full name?" she asked, almost whispering. "Walter Johnson, ma'am." The name didn't spark immediate recognition, but Mrs. Eleanor didn't give up. "And where did you play? When?" Walter hesitated. Speaking of the past always brought pain, but there was something in that lady's kind eyes that encouraged him. "I played in theaters, conservatories, private events. That was over 30 years ago," he said, his voice becoming even lower. 30 years, Mrs. Eleanor murmured, thoughtfully. "Mr. Johnson, by any chance did you ever use another stage name?" The question caught Walter off guard. He looked around, noticing several people still watching them with curiosity. The lady's question touched on very deep wounds. "Yes," he finally admitted, finally. "I went by Walter Adams back then." It was as if a lightning bolt had struck the room. Mrs. Eleanor brought her hand to her chest, her eyes widening in shock. "Walter Adams," she repeated, incredulous. "The Walter Adams?" "Do you know me?" asked Walter, surprised. "Know you?" Mrs. Eleanor laughed through her tears. "Young man, I had the privilege of hearing you play at Carnegie Hall in the 90s. You were considered one of the greatest classical pianists in the United States." A murmur of surprise spread among the guests who were still nearby. Michael paled. He had studied Walter Adams at the conservatory, but the pianist had mysteriously disappeared from the music scene decades ago. "This can't be true," said Michael, shaking his head. "Walter Adams was destined to be one of the greatest pianists in the world. He can't be—" He stopped, realizing the cruelty of his words. "Living on the street," completed Walter, with a sad smile. "Life has its ironies, young man." Richard approached the group, his expression now serious and concerned. What had started as amusement was becoming something much more complex. "Mr. Walter," said Richard, "please forgive me for how you were received. I didn't know, no one knew." "There's nothing to forgive," replied Walter with dignity. "You had no way of knowing. I've changed a lot over these years." "But what happened?" asked Mrs. Eleanor, her voice full of genuine concern. "How did a talent like yours end up—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood what she meant. Walter sighed deeply. Telling that story always reopened poorly healed wounds. "Many things happened, ma'am. Bad decisions, trust placed in the wrong people, health problems." He paused, carefully choosing his words. "And once you fall into that world, it's very hard to get out." The silence that followed was heavy. Everyone there could imagine, but no one truly understood how someone with so much talent had ended up in that situation. "But you still play like a master," said Mrs. Eleanor. "Your talent remains intact." "Talent is never lost," agreed Walter, "but opportunities are." Brian, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, decided it was time to put an end to it. In his mind, a beggar was still a beggar, no matter how many stories he made up. "All right, everyone. This has been very interesting, but now we need to get back to the party's normal schedule," he said, clapping his hands. "Michael, please resume your performance." But Michael didn't move. He was studying Walter with a strange expression, as if something was bothering him. "Wait," said Michael slowly. "If you are truly Walter Adams, you should know the composition Tears of Hope. It was your most famous piece." Walter closed his eyes for a moment, as if the mention of that music brought painful memories. "I know it," he said simply. "Then play it," challenged Michael, a tone of distrust in his voice. This composition was never published in sheet music. Only the composer himself would know how to play it from memory. It was a cruel trap, but Walter understood the reason for the distrust. He slowly returned to the piano, feeling the weight of everyone's gazes in the room. "Tears of Hope was composed during a very difficult time in my life," he said, positioning his hands over the keys. "I've never played it in public since I stopped performing." "Then don't play it," said Mrs. Eleanor gently, noticing the suffering on his face. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone." But Walter had already begun. The first notes of Tears of Hope echoed through the room, and it was as if time had stopped. The music was different from anything he had played before. It was more personal, more intimate, filled with a profound melancholy that touched the soul of every person present. It was impossible to fake that composition. Every note, every pause, every nuance of the interpretation revealed that this music had been born from the heart of the one playing it. There was no possible doubt. That man was truly Walter Adams. Michael sat down heavily in a nearby chair, his face pale. He had studied recordings of that composition for years, dreaming of one day being able to play it with the same emotion he heard in the old recordings. Now, seeing the composer himself perform it live, he realized he had never truly understood the depth of that music. When Walter finished, the silence was deafening. Tears streamed down the faces of several guests. Mrs. Eleanor wept openly, her trembling hands gripping the arm of the nearest chair. "My God," she whispered, "it's really you." Richard approached Walter with a completely transformed expression. All his previous arrogance had vanished, replaced by genuine respect and deep embarrassment. "Maestro Walter," he said, using the title the pianist had earned in his lifetime, "please forgive me. If I had known who you were—" "I already said there's nothing to forgive," Walter interrupted gently. "You reacted based on what you saw, not what you knew about me." "But that's not right," said Richard, shaking his head. "An artist of your caliber shouldn't be going through difficulties like this. Life doesn't ask if we're artists before it knocks us down," Walter replied with a sad smile. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. At that moment, Richard's daughter, Catherine, who had just gotten married, approached the group. At 28, she had a degree in music and had spent years studying piano, though she had chosen to pursue a career in the family business. "Dad, what's happening? Why is everyone crying?" she asked, still wearing her wedding dress. "Catherine, I want you to meet Maestro Walter Adams," said Richard solemnly, "one of the greatest pianists the United States has ever had." Catherine looked at Walter with curiosity and respect. She had studied him at the conservatory, but like many of her generation, she thought he had retired or left the country. "It's an honor to meet you, Maestro," she said, extending her hand. "I studied your compositions in college. They're masterful." "Thank you, miss," replied Walter, gently shaking the bride's hand. "And congratulations on your marriage." "Maestro," continued Catherine, an idea forming in her mind, "would you consider playing on other occasions? We have many events here at the hall, and it would be a privilege to have your music." Brian, who had remained silent, decided it was time to intervene. "Catherine, with all due respect, But we need to think about the establishment's image, he said, trying to sound diplomatic. Our clients expect a certain standard. The comment caused general embarrassment. Richard felt his blood boil. Brian, what did you mean by that? He asked, his voice low but threatening. Well, Mr. Richard, it's just that, Brian stammered, realizing he had made a mistake. The clients might feel uncomfortable with what? Insisted Richard. With his appearance, admitted Brian, sealing his fate. The embarrassment in the hall was palpable. Walter lowered his head, accustomed to this kind of prejudice, but it didn't make the situation any less painful. Brian, said Richard, his voice now loud enough for everyone to hear. You're fired. Mr. Richard, There will be no discussion. Get your things and get out of here now. Brian tried to argue, but Richard had already turned his back. The former manager left the hall humiliated, but his prejudice and lack of vision had cost him his job. Maestro Walter, said Richard, turning his attention to the pianist, please accept my apologies for my former employee's unacceptable behavior, and also accept an invitation. I would like you to become the resident pianist of this establishment. The offer took Walter by surprise. It had been years since he had received a job offer, much less one related to music. Mr. Richard, I appreciate the offer, but... He hesitated, looking at his worn-out clothes. I am in no condition to present myself properly for such a job. That can easily be fixed, Catherine interjected. Father, we can provide everything the maestro needs. Proper clothes, a place to stay while he gets organized. No, Walter said firmly. I will not accept charity. It's not charity, insisted Richard. It's an investment. A pianist of your caliber will add great value to our events. In fact, it would be an honor for us. Walter considered the proposal for a long moment. Dignity had always been very important to him, even in the most difficult times. But perhaps this was a real opportunity to rebuild his life. If it is truly a job, with fair pay and clear responsibilities, then I accept, he finally said. The decision was celebrated with applause by the guests who still remained nearby. Mrs. Eleanor approached Walter with a radiant smile. Maestro, may I ask a personal question? She said. Of course, ma'am. What led you to your current circumstances, if it's not too indiscreet to ask? Walter sighed deeply. It was a long and painful story, but perhaps it was time to share it. It was a combination of factors, Mrs. Eleanor. First, health problems. I developed arthritis in my hands in the 2000s, which significantly affected my ability to play at a professional level. Then there were financial issues. I had poorly invested my savings and lost almost everything. But even so, you still play wonderfully, observed Catherine. The arthritis improved with time and proper treatment, but by the time it did, I had already lost many professional contacts. And when you disappear from the music circuit for a few years, it's as if you never existed. And your family? Asked Mrs. Eleanor gently. Walter closed his eyes for a moment, a deeper pain emerging. My wife left when the problems began. She said she hadn't married an invalid. The words came out with difficulty. My son took her side. We haven't spoken in 15 years. The silence that followed was respectful. Everyone could feel the pain of this man who had lost not only his career, but his entire family. I am so sorry, said Mrs. Eleanor, gently touching his arm. They were difficult times, Walter continued. After I lost the house, I ended up on the streets. At first, I tried playing in squares and subway stations to earn a few dollars, but it's hard to maintain an instrument when you have nowhere to live. How did you manage to practice? Asked Michael, who had approached the group. When I could, I played in churches. Some let me use the piano in exchange for small services. That's how I kept my technique alive all these years. Richard listened in silence, processing the entire story. A man who had been one of the country's greatest musical talents had been reduced to begging for food. It made him reflect on how many other talents might be lost on the streets, ignored by society. Maestro, said Richard, I want you to know that here you will be treated with the respect you deserve, and if there is anything we can do to help you reconnect with your family, thank you. but this is something I need to resolve on my own, replied Walter, if there's even anything left to resolve. Catherine watched the conversation with growing interest. An idea was forming in her mind. Maestro, have you ever considered giving private lessons? She asked. I know many young musicians who would pay a great deal to learn from someone of your caliber. I'm not sure I still have the patience for teaching, admitted Walter. It's been a long time since I've dealt with people regularly. Think about it, suggested Catherine. It would be a way to supplement your income and also pass on your knowledge to a new generation. Michael, who had remained silent for a while, finally spoke up. Maestro, I would like to apologize for how I treated you initially, he said, visibly ashamed. And I would also like to know if you would accept giving me some guidance. It would be an honor to learn from someone I've always admired. Walter studied the young pianist for a moment. There was sincerity in his eyes. Of course, young man. It will be a pleasure to help a fellow musician. The atmosphere in the hall had completely changed. What had begun as a night of humiliation for Walter was turning into something very different. For the first time in years, he felt genuine hope. Well, said Richard, clapping softly, I believe we have much to plan. Maestro, if you'll allow me, I'd like to discuss the details of your new position tomorrow morning. For tonight, please accept our hospitality. We have rooms right here in the establishment where you can rest. That is very generous, said Walter, moved. It's not generosity, it's justice, corrected Richard. Mrs. Eleanor approached Walter one last time before leaving. Maestro, may I give you some advice from someone who has lived many years? She said. Of course, ma'am. Don't be afraid to rebuild your life. You still have so much talent to offer the world. And as for your family, sometimes people need time to mature and recognize their mistakes. Thank you for your wise words, said Walter, touched by the lady's kindness. When the party finally ended and the guests had left, Walter found himself alone in the hall with Richard and Catherine. The grand piano was still there, gleaming under the soft lights. Maestro, said Catherine, may I ask a question? Why did you stop composing? Walter looked at the piano thoughtfully. Composition requires a specific state of mind, he explained. In recent years, I was just trying to survive. There was no room in my mind to create. And now? She asked. Now? Perhaps yes. Perhaps it's time to start creating again. Richard smiled, pleased with the answer. Well, I'll leave you two to talk about music. I need to take care of some event details. Maestro, the back room is at your disposal. It's not luxurious, but it's comfortable and has a private bathroom. After Richard left, Catherine sat in a chair near the piano. Maestro, may I confess something? She said. Of course. During my studies, I always wondered what had happened to Walter Adams. Your compositions were fundamental to my musical education. It's surreal to be talking with you now. Life has these ironies, said Walter, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to start over. Are you afraid, asked Catherine, of returning to the music world after so long? Walter considered the question honestly. Yes, I am. The world has changed so much. Music has changed. I don't know if I still have a place in it. True talent always has a place, assured Catherine, and you proved today that your talent remains intact. They talked for another hour about music, about the challenges of the music industry, and about plans for the future. When Catherine finally left, Walter was alone with the piano. He touched the keys gently, almost whispering a melody that began to form in his mind. It was the beginning of a new composition, the first in decades. He would call it Second Dawn. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. In the following days, Walter's story spread quickly through the musical circles of New York City. Journalists began approaching Richard asking for interviews. Music critics wanted to hear the resurrected pianist, and old professional colleagues came out of retirement to reconnect with their old friend. But not everything was rosy. The sudden exposure also brought problems. Some critics questioned whether Walter really maintained the technical level from decades ago. Others speculated about the real reasons for his downfall. There were even those who suggested it was all just a publicity stunt. Walter faced these comments with the dignity that always characterized him, but internally they stirred his insecurities. And there was a shadow from the past that still haunted him, a truth he hadn't fully shared with anyone. Walter's first official performance as resident pianist was scheduled for the following Friday at a gala dinner for business leaders. During the week, he rehearsed intensely, his hands responding better with each passing day. On Tuesday morning, while practicing in the empty hall, he received an unexpected visitor. A man in his 50s entered the hall, accompanied by Richard. Walter recognized the visitor immediately and his blood ran cold. It was Frederick Miller, a pianist and composer who had been his rival in the 90s. More than that, Frederick was the person directly responsible for Walter's downfall, though few knew it. "Walter," said Frederick with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What a surprise to find you here." "Frederick," Walter replied coldly, stopping his playing. Richard sensed the tension in the air but didn't fully understand what was happening. "Gentlemen, do you know each other?" he asked. "We do," said Frederick. "Walter and I are old acquaintances. We worked together on some projects in the past." The word "together" sounded like a cruel joke to Walter's ears. Frederick hadn't just worked with him, he had stolen from him. "I came here because I heard you were making a comeback," Frederick continued, approaching the piano. "I thought it would be interesting to chat about the old times." "I don't think we have much to talk about," said Walter, keeping his voice controlled. "Oh, but we do," insisted Frederick, his tone becoming more threatening. "Especially about certain compositions that might resurface with your return." Richard felt that something was very wrong with the conversation, but politely excused himself, saying he had other commitments. When they were alone, Frederick showed his true face. "So, Walter, decided to get back in the game?" he said, sitting on the piano bench next to where Walter was. "Interesting choice considering everything that happened." "What do you want, Frederick?" Walter asked directly. "I want to make sure you understand the rules," Frederick replied. "Your return could be problematic for certain people." "Problematic how?" Walter challenged. Frederick chuckled softly, an unpleasant sound. "You know very well what I'm talking about. Those 3 compositions you lost in the 90s. Remember them?" Walter clenched his fists. How could he forget? Frederick had stolen 3 of his best compositions, registering them under his own name when Walter was dealing with health problems. At the time, Walter didn't have the financial resources to legally fight the theft. "I haven't lost anything," said Walter. "They were stolen." "Prove it," challenged Frederick. "Do you have the original manuscripts, recordings of the first performances, witnesses?" Walter knew he had none of these. The manuscripts had been lost when he was evicted from his home. The recordings were too amateurish to serve as evidence, and the few people who had originally heard the compositions wouldn't remember after so much time. "These compositions have earned me a great deal of money over the years," continued Frederick, "and they continue to do so. I won't let a beggar ruin that." "I'm no longer a beggar," said Walter, finding strength in his voice. "No?" Frederick laughed. "A week ago you were begging for food on the street, and you could return there very quickly if necessary." The threat was clear. Frederick had the resources, influence, and connections to destroy any attempt Walter made to re-establish himself in the music world. "What do you want from me?" asked Walter, weary. "I want you to stay in your place," replied Frederick. "Play your little pianos here in this hall, but don't try to go beyond that. Don't record albums, don't compose new pieces, don't give interviews talking about the past. Keep a low profile and everyone is happy. And if I refuse? Then I'll make sure the world knows the truth about Walter Adams," said Frederick, rising from the bench. "The truth about how you lost everything because you were an irresponsible drunk who couldn't honor his commitments." Walter swallowed hard. That was the lie Frederick had spread years ago to justify his disappearance from the music scene. In truth, Walter had developed severe arthritis and depression, but Frederick had turned it into a story about alcoholism and professional irresponsibility. "No one would believe that today," said Walter, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "No?" Frederick smiled maliciously. "A man who spent years living on the streets, who suddenly appears claiming to be a great pianist, It would be very easy to convince people you're trying to take advantage of the situation for fame and money. The reality of the threat hit Walter like a punch to the stomach. Frederick was right. With the right resources and connections, it would be relatively simple to destroy his reputation before it was even fully rebuilt. "Think carefully about what you're doing, Walter," said Frederick, heading for the exit. "You've gotten a second chance here. Don't waste it because of old grudges." After Frederick left, Walter remained alone in the hall, his hands trembling not from hunger or cold, but from anger and frustration. 30 years later, the man who had stolen his best creations was still controlling his life. He sat down heavily on the piano bench but couldn't bring himself to play. Frederick's words echoed in his mind, bringing back all the insecurities and fears he had tried to bury. Perhaps Frederick was right. Perhaps he should be content with playing in the hall and not aspire to more than that. After all, it was more than he had a week ago. But as these doubts gnawed at him, a stubborn part of Walter refused to give up. He had lost so much in life, but he wouldn't lose his dignity again. That evening, Catherine appeared in the hall for one of her regular conversations with Walter. She immediately sensed something was wrong. "Maestro, are you all right? You look worried," she said, sitting in a nearby chair. Walter hesitated. Telling Catherine about Frederick would mean exposing old wounds and perhaps putting her in a difficult position. "I'm just nervous about Friday's performance," he lied. "Are you sure?" insisted Catherine. "Can I help with anything?" For a moment, Walter considered telling her everything, but he decided it wasn't fair to involve Catherine in his past problems. "I'm fine, really. Thank you for your concern." Catherine wasn't completely convinced, but she respected Walter's privacy. "Maestro, may I make a suggestion?" she said. "Of course." "How about we record some of your performances?" she suggested. "Not necessarily to publicize, but as a record. It would be a shame not to document your return." Catherine's suggestion, though well-intentioned, touched exactly on the point Frederick had threatened him about. Any kind of recording or documentation could be used against him. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," said Walter cautiously. "I don't feel ready for that kind of exposure yet." "Of course, it doesn't have to be public at all," insisted Catherine. "Just for our personal archives, but if you don't feel comfortable, that's perfectly fine." Walter realized he was being too paranoid. Catherine had no ulterior motives, and he couldn't let his fear of Frederick control all his decisions. "Perhaps after Friday's performance," he said. If all goes well." "Perfect," smiled Catherine. "And Maestro, if there's anything troubling you, know that you can count on me. I consider you not just an employee, but a friend." Catherine's words touched Walter deeply. It had been a long time since anyone had called him a friend. "Thank you, Catherine. That means a great deal to me." That night, alone in his room at the back of the hall, Walter made a decision. He wouldn't let Frederick control his life again. If he was going to return to the music world, he would do it with his head held high, regardless of the consequences. Friday arrived quickly. The gala dinner was scheduled to begin at 8 in the evening, with the musical performance at 9. During the day, Walter rehearsed his chosen pieces, 2 classical compositions, and, as the grand finale, Second Dawn, his new creation. At 7 in the evening, as he was getting ready in his room, Richard knocked on the door. "Maestro, how are you feeling?" asked Richard. "Nervous but prepared," Walter answered honestly. "Excellent, and I have good news. A music critic from the Times will be here tonight. He heard your story and wants to do a feature." Walter's blood ran cold. This was exactly the kind of exposure Frederick had warned him to avoid. "Mr. Williams, I would prefer no press coverage for now," he said. "Why not?" Richard seemed surprised. "It would be an excellent opportunity to promote your work." Walter realized he needed to give a plausible explanation without revealing the whole truth. "It's just that I don't feel completely prepared for that level of attention yet," he explained. "I'd prefer to build my reputation gradually, through my work, not through the media." Richard understood the concern. "You're right, I'll speak with the journalist. He can attend the performance, but no feature for now. Thank you for understanding." By 8:30, the hall was filled with business people, lawyers, doctors, and other professionals from the New York elite. The atmosphere was sophisticated, but less formal than a traditional classical concert. Walter watched the audience from backstage, his hands slightly sweaty. It had been decades since his last performance for such an audience. "Maestro," Catherine appeared at his side. "Ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied. "You're going to be wonderful," she encouraged. "I'm sure of it." When Richard stepped onto the small stage to introduce him, Walter took a deep breath and walked to the piano. The audience fell silent, curious to meet the pianist they had heard so much about. "Ladies and gentlemen," said Richard, "it is my great honor to present Maestro Walter Adams, one of the greatest musical talents the United States has ever produced." The applause was polite but reserved. Most people there were unfamiliar with Walter's work and were prepared for a pleasant performance but without great expectations. Walter sat at the piano and adjusted the bench. For a brief moment, his eyes met those of Frederick, who was seated at a table at the back of the hall. The man had shown up unannounced, clearly there to intimidate, but instead of being shaken, Walter used Frederick's presence as fuel. He positioned his hands over the keys and began with Chopin, Ballade No. 1 in G minor. From the very first notes, it was clear that this would not be an ordinary performance. Walter's impeccable technique combined with an interpretation filled with emotion and life experience. Every note seemed to tell a story. Every pause carried meaning. The audience, initially polite, was gradually won over. Side conversations ceased, utensils stopped clinking against plates, and genuine attention took over the room. When he finished the first piece, the applause was significantly warmer. For the second performance, Walter chose Bach Prelude and Fugue No. 1 in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier. His interpretation transformed the technical complexity of the work into something accessible and exciting. The newspaper critic, seated at a table near the stage, was visibly impressed. He was constantly taking notes on his pad, clearly preparing material for a future article. Frederick, on the other hand, watched with an increasingly grim expression. He had hoped that Walter would give a mediocre performance, one that would confirm his narrative of decline. Instead, he was witnessing a masterful performance. For the grand finale, Walter turned to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to conclude with an original composition created especially for this occasion. It's called Second Dawn." And then he began to play his new creation. The music was different from anything he had presented before. It was modern without being experimental, emotional without being melancholic, complex without being inaccessible. Second Dawn told the story of Walter's own life. It began with dark themes representing the difficult years, gradually evolving into more hopeful melodies, culminating in a triumphant finale that celebrated renewal and the possibility of a fresh start. When the last note echoed through the hall, there was complete silence for a few seconds. Then, one person stood up and began to clap. Another followed. In moments, the entire audience was on its feet, applauding with genuine enthusiasm. Walter stood up and bowed, tears of emotion streaming down his face. It was the first standing ovation he had received in over 30 years. Among the audience, Frederick was pale. The performance had been so exceptional that it would be impossible to discredit Walter now. Any attempt at defamation would seem obviously motivated by envy or malice. After the performance, Walter was surrounded by guests wanting to congratulate him and get to know him better. Several business owners asked about the possibility of hiring him for private events. A conservatory director was interested in offering him a teaching position. The newspaper critic approached discreetly. "Maestro, I know you don't want to give an interview now, but when you feel ready, I would love to talk about your journey. Today's performance was extraordinary." "Thank you," said Walter. "When I feel prepared, I will get in touch." Frederick tried to approach, but Walter saw him coming and turned away, continuing his conversations with other guests. Around midnight, as the event was winding down, Walter finally managed a quiet moment with Richard and Catherine. "Maestro, it was absolutely fantastic," said Catherine, still emotional. "Second Dawn is a masterpiece. You must register it." "That's an interesting idea," Walter agreed, his confidence renewed by the warm reception. "And I've received at least 20 inquiries about your availability for other events," added Richard. If you'd like, we can start scheduling regular performances." "Yes, I think I'm ready for that," said Walter. While they were talking, Frederick finally managed to approach. His expression was tense, but he tried to maintain a friendly facade in front of Richard and Catherine. "Walter, congratulations on your performance," he said stiffly. "It was surprising." "Thank you, Frederick," Walter replied politely but coldly. "Can we speak in private?" asked Frederick. "Actually, I'd prefer our conversation to be right here," said Walter, a new courage in his voice. "In front of my friends." Frederick realized he had lost the psychological advantage he held over Walter. "Well, I just wanted to say that perhaps we've had some misunderstandings in the past," he said, trying a different approach. "Misunderstandings," repeated Walter, his voice growing stronger. "Is that what you call theft now?" Richard and Catherine exchanged looks of surprise and concern. "I don't know what you're talking about," said Frederick, trying to maintain his composure. "You're talking about the 3 compositions you registered under your name in the 90s, Walter said clearly. "Summer Rain, Moonless Night, and Way Home. All created by me, all stolen by you when I was going through hard times." The embarrassment in the group was palpable. Frederick was cornered, his face turning red. "You can't prove any of that," he said, abandoning any pretense of friendliness. "Perhaps I can't prove it legally," Walter admitted, "but I can play these compositions from memory, with all the variations and modifications that were never registered. I can explain every harmonic choice, every thematic development. Can you?" Frederick knew he couldn't. He had stolen the finished scores but never truly understood the internal structure of the compositions. "Maestro," Richard intervened, clearly shocked, "are you saying your compositions were plagiarized?" "Yes," Walter confirmed, "and Frederick knows it." "This is a very serious accusation," said Richard, looking at Frederick. "Mr. Miller, what do you have to say about this?" Frederick realized he was in an untenable situation. Denying the accusations completely would seem obviously false, but admitting them would ruin his reputation. "There were some confusing contractual matters at the time," he said vaguely, "but everything was resolved legally." "That's a lie," Walter said firmly. "There was nothing legal about it. You took advantage of me being sick and vulnerable to steal my work." The tension was palpable. Catherine looked at Frederick with a mixture of disgust and disappointment. "Mr. Miller," she said coldly, "I think it's best if you leave." Frederick realized he had completely lost control of the situation. His attempt to intimidate Walter had backfired. "This isn't over," he murmured, but without his earlier strength. "You're right," said Walter. "It isn't over. I will reclaim what's mine, one way or another." Frederick left the hall humiliated and defeated, knowing his comfortable position was threatened. After he departed, Richard and Catherine listened attentively as Walter told the whole story of his stolen compositions. Their indignation was genuine. "Maestro, this is unacceptable," said Richard. "We must do something about this." "What can I do after so much time?" asked Walter, though now he sounded more determined than defeated. "We can look for specialized lawyers," suggested Catherine. "Even if it's hard to prove legally, we can at least expose the truth publicly." "And you could record the original compositions," added Richard. "Show the world how they should sound when interpreted by the true composer." The idea of fighting back, of no longer passively accepting injustice, began taking shape in Walter's mind. "Would you really support me in this?" he asked. "Of course we would," they both said in unison. For the first time in decades, Walter felt he wasn't alone. He had allies, people willing to fight alongside him for justice. "Then let's do it," he decided. "Let's reclaim what was stolen." In the following weeks, Walter's story grew to proportions nobody had imagined. The news about the stolen compositions spread quickly through the music world, sparking heated debates about ethics, intellectual property, and the vulnerability of artists. Frederick tried to defend himself publicly, but his version of events convinced no one. Music experts who compared the old recordings with Walter's interpretations confirmed that only the true composer could possess such intimacy with the works. a copyright attorney, took interest in the case and agreed to represent Walter pro bono, seeing an opportunity to establish important precedents for protecting vulnerable artists. Meanwhile, Walter continued his performances at Richard's salon, which was now always packed. People came not only for the exceptional music, but to support an artist who had become a symbol of resistance and dignity. Second Dawn became his most requested piece, and he began working on a full suite based on the theme of renewal and overcoming. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. One Tuesday morning, 3 months after his first performance at the salon, Walter received a call that would change everything again. "Hello, is this Walter Adams?" asked a male voice on the other end. "Yes, speaking." "My name is Charles Johnson. I'm your son." The silence that followed was deafening. Walter sat down heavily, his legs suddenly weak. "Charles," he managed to whisper. "Yes, Dad. I saw the news about you, about your return to music, and about what happened to your compositions." Tears began streaming down Walter's face. "My son, after all these years." "Dad, I want to apologize," said Charles, his voice also choked with emotion. "I was young when everything happened. I believed my mother's version. I believed you had abandoned us. Only now do I understand what really happened." "Where are you?" asked Walter. "I'm in Chicago. I'm a doctor here. And Dad, I have a granddaughter of yours who would very much like to meet you." The news that he was a grandfather left Walter completely speechless. "A granddaughter?" he managed to ask. "Yes, Sophia. She's 8 years old and learning piano. When she found out her grandfather was a famous pianist, she was fascinated." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Walter. His granddaughter was learning the instrument that had been both his glory and his curse. "Charles, I would very much like to meet her and to see you again. We're coming to New York City next weekend," said Charles. Would you like to meet us?" "More than anything in the world," replied Walter. The following Saturday, Walter waited nervously at the salon when Richard and Catherine arrived to support him in the family reunion. He had spent hours deciding what to play for his granddaughter, finally choosing some simpler, more melodic pieces. When Charles entered the salon accompanied by a little girl with curly hair and bright eyes, Walter felt his heart would burst with emotion. "Grandpa!" shouted Sophia, running toward him. The hug they shared was filled with all the lost years, all the unshed tears, all the unspoken words. "Daddy told me you're a very famous pianist," said Sophia, looking at her grandfather with admiration. "Can you play something for me?" "Of course, my princess," said Walter, still holding his granddaughter's hand. He sat at the piano with Sophia by his side and began playing a simplified version of Second Dawn, adapted so she could follow along with a few simple notes. Seeing his granddaughter playing piano beside him, even in such an elementary way, was one of the most moving experiences of Walter's life. Charles watched the scene with tears in his eyes, finally understanding completely what his family had lost all those years. "Dad," he said when the music ended, "I want to make up for lost time. I want Sophia to grow up knowing her grandfather, and I want to be present in her life in every way you'll allow me," replied Walter. In the following months, Walter's life was completely transformed. The lawsuit against Frederick was progressing favorably, with mounting evidence that the compositions had indeed been stolen. His performances at Richard's salon continued to draw full houses, and he began receiving invitations to play at prestigious theaters and concert halls. Most importantly, his relationship with Charles and Sophia deepened with every meeting. He traveled to Chicago every other week, and they came to New York City on alternate weekends. Sophia proved to be a dedicated and talented student, and Walter discovered that teaching music to his granddaughter was one of the greatest joys of his new life. "Grandpa," she said during one of their lessons, "when I grow up, I want to play piano just like you." "You already play better than I did at your age," replied Walter, proud. "Really?" she laughed, doubting. "Really. But you know what's more important than playing well." "What?" "It's never giving up on your dreams no matter what happens." The lesson applied as much to Sophia as it did to Walter himself. 6 months after the reunion with Frederick at the salon, the court ruled in Walter's favor. Although the elapsed time prevented a complete reversal of the copyright registrations, Frederick was ordered to pay substantial compensation and to include Walter's name as co-author in future performances of the works. More important than the legal victory was the moral one. The American musical community had officially recognized the injustice committed and given its full support to Walter. "How do you feel?" asked Catherine on the day the court decision was announced. "I feel like I can finally look to the future without carrying the weight of the past," replied Walter, and the future looked bright. Walter had been invited to record an album of his original compositions, including Second Dawn and 2 new pieces he had recently composed. But the greatest achievement was yet to come. On the first anniversary of his first performance at the Salon, Richard and Catherine organized a special concert. The event was to be a retrospective of Walter's journey, featuring performances of his recovered compositions and the premiere of his new suite, Life Cycles. The audience included music critics, other pianists, music students, and of course his family. Charles had brought not only Sophia, but also his wife, whom Walter met for the first time. When Walter took the stage that night, he was no longer the humiliated and hungry man who had entered the Salon a year before. He was a reborn artist, a man who had regained his family, his dignity, and his place in the world. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, "exactly 1 year ago I came to this salon, asking only for a plate of food in exchange for music. Today I return here with a heart full of gratitude for all the people who helped me rebuild my life." The applause was warm and prolonged. "This performance is dedicated to everyone who believes it's never too late to start over," Walter continued, "and especially to my granddaughter Sophia, who taught me that music is even more beautiful when shared with love." The concert that followed was masterful. Walter played with a passion and technique that surpassed even his best past performances. Every note carried not only musical skill, but all the life experience he had accumulated. When he played Second Dawn as an encore, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. The music had become an anthem of hope and renewal, inspiring people far beyond musical circles. After the concert, during the reception, Mrs. Eleanor approached Walter. "Maestro," she said, now 80 years old and even more frail, but with bright eyes, "may I say this was the most moving concert I have ever witnessed in my entire life." "Mrs. Eleanor, thank you for believing in me from day one," replied Walter, respectfully kissing the elderly woman's hand. "I always knew true talent finds a way," she said. "You are the living proof of that." Later, when the party was winding down and only family and closest friends remained, Sophia approached her grandfather. "Grandpa, can I play a song for you?" she asked. "Of course, my princess." Sophia sat at the piano and began to play a simplified version of Second Dawn that she had learned especially for that occasion. Her technique was still elementary, but her interpretation carried a love for music that deeply touched Walter's heart. When she finished, Walter picked her up in his arms. "Sophia, do you know what the most beautiful part of this whole story is, Carl?" he asked. "What, Grandpa?" "It's that now I can pass on to you everything I've learned about music and about life, and you'll be able to pass it on to your children, and they to theirs. Music never dies. It just continues through the people we love." "I'll take good care of your music, Grandpa," Sophia promised solemnly. "I know you will, my dear, I know you will." In that moment, surrounded by his family and friends, having regained not only his career but also his dignity and purpose, Walter fully understood the meaning of Second Dawn. It wasn't just about a new chance, but about understanding that the true wealth of life lies not in what we achieve, but in what we share. That talent without love is empty, but love for art can overcome any adversity. Months later, when his album Second Dawn was released and became an unexpected success, when young pianists sought his lessons, when his story became a documentary and inspired other people in vulnerable situations, Walter still remembered that cold night when he asked only for a plate of food. But now he knew that what he had really asked for, without realizing it, was a second chance to be who he always was, a man who loved music above all else and who found in art a way to connect hearts and transform lives. And that second chance was not only granted to him, but exceeded his wildest dreams. Richards Hall became a respected cultural center where young talents could perform and experienced artists could share knowledge. Walter became a kind of unofficial mentor, always willing to help those who needed guidance or just a friendly ear. Frederick, on the other hand, saw his career decline rapidly after the scandal. Without Walter's real talent to sustain his reputation, and with the music community knowing the truth about his own compositions, he was gradually forgotten. Ironically, this served as a powerful lesson about the difference between genuine talent and success built on lies. True talent, like Walter's, may be temporarily overshadowed, but never completely destroyed. Today, 3 years after that first night at the Hall, Walter Johnson is once again one of the most respected pianists in the United States. But more importantly, he is a fulfilled man, surrounded by love and with a clear purpose in life. His performances continue to sell out, his compositions are studied in conservatories, and his story inspires thousands of people facing difficult times. But none of this compares to the joy he feels when he sees Sophia playing the piano, or when he receives a call from Charles, updating him on the family's progress. Because Walter learned the most important lesson of all, that true success is not measured by fame or money, but by the ability to touch lives, to create beauty, and to never lose hope, even in the darkest moments. And every time his hands touch the piano keys, he remembers that hungry and desperate man who walked into the hall asking only for food, never imagining he was about to regain much more than he had lost. He was about to find himself again. End of story. So, what did you think of this incredible story of overcoming and rebirth? Can you imagine how many talents might be hidden around us, just waiting for an opportunity? Maestro Walter's story teaches us that it's never too late to start over, and that a person's true worth is not in their appearance, but in what they carry in their heart. Leave in the comments what moved you most in this story, and if you know of similar cases in real life. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more stories that touch the soul.